Picture this. It's late afternoon, somewhere in ancient Europe, around 30,000 years ago, and a group is moving slowly through a valley, picking through the aftermath of something rough. Maybe a hunt went badly, maybe sickness moved through camp the week before, maybe a river crossing turned violent and unpredictable, the way rivers occasionally just decide to be. Whatever happened, there's a small child sitting alone near the remains of a fire pit that's gone cold, too young to fully understand what's missing, but old enough to know that something is very, very wrong. No parents nearby, no obvious adult claiming responsibility. Just a kid, alone, in a world that does not pause for anyone's grief, and absolutely does not pause for anyone's vulnerability. So what actually happens next? Does that child just become a tragic footnote, quietly fading out of the story the way nature documentaries love to imply, with some somber narrator voice saying, "The young one did not survive the season"? Or is there something else going on here? Something the fossil record and the comparative behavior of human societies actually suggest happened far more often than you'd expect? Stick around, because what happened to orphaned ancient humans is a genuinely surprising story, and it might completely change how you think about what kind of species we actually evolved to be underneath all the modern conveniences. Let's start with the uncomfortable baseline truth, because we have to be honest about it before we get to the more hopeful parts. Death was a constant, looming presence throughout ancient human life in a way that's almost impossible for most people today to fully internalize. Childbirth carried serious risk for mothers. Infectious disease, injury from hunting, predator attacks, accidents, and simple bad luck could remove a parent from a child's life with brutal suddenness and zero warning. Estimates drawn from skeletal remains and comparative studies of small-scale societies suggest that a meaningful percentage of ancient children lost at least one parent before reaching adulthood, and losing both parents, while less common, was absolutely not some rare freak occurrence. Orphaning, in other words, wasn't an edge case ancient social systems could afford to ignore. It was a recurring, predictable feature of life that groups had to actively plan around, whether they consciously thought of it that way or not. And here's where the myth we need to bust comes in immediately, because it's a big, persistent one. There's a deeply ingrained cultural assumption baked into a century of bad documentaries and lazy textbook illustrations that ancient life operated on some kind of brutal, individualistic, every creature for itself logic, where a parentless child would simply be left to die because keeping them alive offered no immediate benefit to anyone else. That assumption is not just wrong, it's almost backwards from what the actual evidence suggests. Humans are, and almost certainly always were, one of the most cooperative, socially interdependent species on this entire planet, and that cooperation extended directly to the care of children who lost their parents. The idea that ancient groups would simply abandon a vulnerable child the moment their biological parents died badly misunderstands both human psychology and the actual practical logic of small group survival. Let's talk about why, starting with something called cooperative breeding, which is honestly one of the most important and underrated concepts in understanding ancient human childcare. Unlike most primates, where a mother handles the overwhelming majority of childcare more or less alone, humans evolved a system where child rearing was distributed across multiple individuals within a group. Grandmothers, older siblings, aunts, uncles, and unrelated group members all played meaningful roles in feeding, protecting, teaching, and supervising children, not just the biological mother and father. Researchers studying this pattern have proposed that this distributed childcare system, sometimes called the cooperative breeding hypothesis, may have been absolutely essential to human evolutionary success, precisely because human children take such an unusually long time to become self-sufficient. A system that depends entirely on two specific biological parents surviving long enough to raise a child to independence is an incredibly fragile system in a world full of disease, predators, and accidents. A system where childcare responsibility is spread across an entire group is dramatically more resilient, because losing any single individual, even both parents, doesn't necessarily mean losing the support structure a child actually needs to survive. This is genuinely one of the most compelling explanations for why orphaned children in ancient groups weren't simply left to fend for themselves. The social structure wasn't built around the fragile assumption that two specific people would always be available. It was built, likely through countless generations of trial and error, around the much sturdier assumption that the group as a whole bears responsibility for raising its children, with specific individuals stepping in and out of that role as circumstances demanded. A child who lost both parents wasn't losing their entire support system. They were losing two specific contributors to a system that ideally had been deliberately designed with redundancy built in from the start. Now let's talk about grandmothers specifically, because there's an entire, genuinely fascinating area of evolutionary biology built around explaining explaining why human women, almost uniquely among mammals, tend to live well past their reproductive years. This is sometimes called the grandmother hypothesis, and it proposes that older women who survived past menopause provided such significant childcare and resource-gathering support to their grandchildren and other young relatives that this support directly improved child survival rates enough to favor the evolution of extended human lifespan itself. Think about what that actually implies. Evolution doesn't typically favor traits with no clear survival benefit, and yet humans evolved unusually long post-reproductive lifespans compared to most other animals. The leading explanation is that grandmothers, freed from their own direct reproductive demands, became crucial caretakers and providers for the next generation, including, very plausibly, orphaned grandchildren who'd lost one or both parents. An orphaned child with a living grandmother wasn't necessarily facing a survival crisis at all. They were potentially facing a fairly smooth transition into an already functioning alternative caregiving relationship. But what about a child who lost everyone, parents and grandparents alike? This is where things get genuinely interesting, and where the actual archaeological and ethnographic record offers some surprisingly direct, comforting answers. Anthropological studies of small-scale societies around the world have documented extensive systems of informal adoption and fostering, where orphaned children are absorbed into other families within the same group, often with remarkably little social friction or formal process involved. In many such societies, the distinction between your biological child and a child you're responsible for raising is far less rigid than modern Western culture tends to assume. Kinship terms in many small-scale societies extend well beyond direct biological relationships, with children commonly referring to multiple adults using terms equivalent to mother or father, reflecting genuinely overlapping caregiving responsibilities rather than one exclusive, singular parental relationship. This pattern almost certainly extends deep into ancient human history. If a child's biological parents died, the most likely outcome, based on everything we know about human social structure and cooperative behavior, wasn't abandonment. It was absorption into another family unit within the same group, sometimes formally acknowledged, sometimes simply happening organically as other adults stepped in to fill the obvious gap. A skilled hunter who'd lost his own children to illness might informally take on responsibility for an orphaned child needing a provider. A woman already nursing her own infant might take on double duty, nursing an orphaned baby alongside her own, a practice called allonursing that's been documented extensively in primates and in human societies alike. The exact configuration would have varied enormously depending on the specific group, the specific circumstances, and frankly, the specific personalities involved. But the underlying pattern, group absorption rather than abandonment, shows up again and again in the comparative evidence we actually have access to. Let's bring in some direct archaeological evidence here, because this isn't purely theoretical reasoning built on comparative studies of modern societies. There's compelling skeletal evidence from multiple ancient sites showing individuals who survived serious childhood illness or disability, conditions that would have made self-sufficient survival essentially impossible without sustained outside care. We've touched on this in earlier videos regarding disabled and injured ancient humans generally, but it applies with particular force to children specifically. A child with a serious illness or developmental condition that left lasting physical evidence in their bones and who nonetheless survived into adulthood represents direct physical proof that someone, or more likely several people, dedicated significant resources and sustained attention to keeping that child alive well beyond what pure biological obligation between parent and offspring alone would explain. This is exactly the kind of evidence that supports the broader pattern of group-based, rather than strictly parent-based childcare throughout ancient human history. Now, I want to be careful here because I don't want to paint an unrealistically rosy, sanitized picture of ancient orphan care as some kind of guaranteed automatic safety net that always worked perfectly for every single child in every single circumstance. That would be dishonest, and frankly a little insulting to how genuinely hard survival actually was. Resources were not infinite. Groups facing severe famine, harsh winters, or population pressure almost certainly faced genuinely difficult, sometimes heartbreaking decisions about how to allocate scarce food and care among many dependents, including orphaned children competing for attention and resources alongside children who still had living parents directly invested in their survival. There's no reason to assume every single orphaned child in ancient history received identical, ideal care. Some almost certainly received less attention, less food, less protection than children with present biological parents fiercely advocating specifically for them. Some almost certainly did not survive. particularly during periods of genuine crisis when a group's total capacity to care for dependents was already stretched dangerously thin. The system wasn't perfect, and it would be misleading to suggest otherwise. But here's the important distinction worth holding on to. Imperfect care and active abandonment are two very different things, and the weight of evidence we actually have points firmly toward the former being the common pattern, not the latter. Orphaned children in ancient groups likely faced real disadvantages compared to children with living parents directly fighting for their interests within the group's social and resource dynamics. But disadvantaged is a completely different situation from abandoned to die alone, and conflating the two badly misrepresents what the actual evidence consistently suggests happened. Let's talk about something genuinely fascinating here: the social and practical value an orphaned child could actually bring to a new family unit, because this wasn't necessarily a purely charitable, one-directional act of pure generosity from the adopting family. Children, even fairly young ones, contributed real, tangible value to ancient households well before reaching full physical maturity. Older children could help care for younger siblings, freeing up adult time for other essential tasks. Children learning specific skills, whether tool-making, foraging knowledge, or tracking, represented a genuine future investment for any family willing to put in the early effort and resources required to raise them properly. And on a less practical, more emotional level that absolutely shouldn't be dismissed or treated as secondary, ancient humans, exactly like modern humans, almost certainly formed genuine emotional attachments to children they raised regardless of strict biological relationship. The capacity for parental love and attachment isn't some switch that only activates for biological offspring specifically. It's a broader, more flexible system rooted in proximity, caregiving behavior, and sustained bonding, which is exactly why adoptive and foster relationships throughout all of human history, ancient and modern alike, can feel every bit as genuinely loving and committed as biological ones. There's also a fascinating angle here involving group identity and long-term self-interest that's worth unpacking, because it adds another layer to why orphan absorption made such consistent practical sense beyond pure altruism. A group's overall strength, both in terms of immediate labor and long-term survival prospects, depended directly on having enough capable members across all age groups to handle the full range of tasks required for ongoing survival. Losing potential future contributors, which is exactly what an unsupported orphaned child represents if left to die, represented a genuine, measurable loss to the entire group's long-term prospects, not just some abstract moral tragedy affecting one unlucky individual. Groups that developed reliable systems for absorbing and raising orphaned children, rather than simply losing them to abandonment or neglect, would have maintained larger, more stable populations over time compared to groups that didn't bother, which means this kind of cooperative orphan care likely faced real, ongoing selective pressure favoring its development and persistence across countless generations of ancient human social evolution. Let's also talk about something that gets surprisingly little attention in most discussions of ancient childhood: the role older orphaned children, ones already old enough to contribute meaningfully to group survival, might have played in actively shaping their own circumstances rather than simply being passive recipients of whatever care adults decided to provide. An orphaned child of, say, 10 or 12 years old, in a world where that age already meant real, expected contribution to group survival, wasn't a helpless infant requiring total dependency. They could demonstrate value directly through their own actions, through skill, through reliability, through making themselves genuinely useful to whichever family unit they ended up attached to. This doesn't mean older orphaned children faced some kind of brutal, transactional, earn your keep or starve existence, but it does suggest that orphaned children weren't necessarily purely passive victims of circumstance. Many almost certainly played an active role in securing their own place within a new family structure, much the way children throughout all of human history have generally found ways to make themselves valued and needed within whatever household circumstances they find themselves placed into. Now let's address something genuinely darker, because honesty about the full range of ancient experience matters here. And not every documented historical and ethnographic account of orphan treatment across human societies is uniformly positive. There's evidence across various documented small-scale and historical societies of orphaned children occasionally facing harsher treatment, reduced resource allocation, or lower social status compared to children with present biological parents actively advocating on their behalf. Step-parent and foster relationships throughout human history broadly have sometimes carried documented risks of neglect or mistreatment that biological parental parental relationships statistically show somewhat less frequently. A pattern researchers studying family dynamics across cultures have noted repeatedly. It would be dishonest to pretend ancient orphan experiences were universally warm, supportive, and uniformly positive. Human social behavior, ancient and modern alike, includes a real range of outcomes, from genuinely loving, committed adoptive care all the way to neglect and mistreatment. And there's no reason to assume ancient societies sat exclusively at the generous end of that spectrum across every single case. But even accounting honestly for that darker range of possible outcomes, the overall pattern that emerges from the actual evidence still points strongly toward group absorption, and continued survival being dramatically more common than outright abandonment. Even imperfect, unequal care within a new family structure generally produced far better survival odds than complete isolation ever could have. A child receiving slightly less food and attention than a biological child in the same household was still, in almost every realistic ancient scenario, in a dramatically better position than a child with genuinely no caregiver at all, exposed directly to predators, starvation, and the elements with zero protective social structure whatsoever. Let's bring this back to something a little more specific and grounded, because all this broad anthropological theory can start to feel abstract without a concrete picture attached to it. Imagine you're an ancient woman who recently lost her own infant to illness, a genuinely devastating common tragedy in a world without modern medicine. Now imagine a child from a different family in your group loses both parents within the same difficult season. The overlap there isn't subtle, and it almost certainly wasn't lost on the people actually living through it at the time. A grieving mother with available milk and an aching, very real need to nurture. Meeting an orphaned child with an urgent, immediate need for exactly that kind of care isn't some elaborate, calculated social engineering scheme requiring formal meetings and careful negotiation. It's an obvious, natural, almost inevitable pairing that human social instinct would have pushed toward almost automatically, without needing any kind of formal system, written rule, or deliberate top-down group decision to make it happen. Ancient social structures didn't necessarily need explicit policies for handling orphaned children, because basic human empathy, attachment instinct, and practical necessity were already doing most of that work quietly, informally, and remarkably effectively in the background. There's also something worth mentioning about how children themselves processed and adapted to this kind of profound loss, because resilience in children, even very young ones, shows up consistently across both historical and modern accounts of orphaning and loss. Children are, in many documented respects, remarkably adaptable when provided with even moderately stable alternative caregiving relationships relatively soon after losing their original parents. This isn't to minimize or downplay the genuine trauma and grief involved in losing a parent at any age, which was almost certainly just as real and just as painful for ancient children as it is for children today. But it does suggest that ancient orphaned children, given the relatively high likelihood of being absorbed into a new caregiving relationship reasonably soon after their loss, based on everything we've covered, had genuinely reasonable prospects for eventually building stable, secure attachments again, even after experiencing profound early loss. Let's circle back to that child sitting alone by the cold fire pit from the very beginning of all this, because their story, based on everything the evidence actually suggests, very likely didn't end in tragic abandonment the way old, lazy documentary tropes might have you assume. More probably within hours or days, someone from the group, a grieving mother, a watchful grandmother, a couple who'd always wanted another child, an aunt who'd already half-raised this kid anyway through countless shared meals and shared chores, stepped forward and simply absorbed that child into their own household without a great deal of fuss or formal ceremony. The kinship terms shifted slightly, the sleeping arrangements adjusted, and life, in all its relentless, demanding, ancient difficulty, simply continued forward, with one more child folded quietly into a family that wasn't originally theirs by blood, but became theirs anyway, through the simple, repeated, unglamorous act of consistent care. So what happened to orphaned ancient humans? Based on cooperative breeding theory, the grandmother hypothesis, extensive comparative evidence from small-scale societies around the world, and direct skeletal evidence of sustained care for vulnerable individuals, the honest answer is considerably more hopeful than most people probably expected walking into this video. Orphaned children weren't routinely abandoned to fend for themselves against an indifferent, brutal world. They were, far more often than not, absorbed into the wider fabric of group life, cared for by an entire flexible network of relatives and committed group members rather than depending entirely on two specific biological parents who might or might not survive long enough to finish the job. It wasn't a perfect system. It carried real disadvantages and real risks, and not every single child experienced equally generous, attentive care. But it was a system built fundamentally around the idea that children belonged to the whole group, not just to two specific people, and that single structural choice, repeated and reinforced across countless generations, may have been one of the quiet, underappreciated reasons our species managed to survive brutal conditions that would have wiped out a less cooperative, less socially flexible animal entirely. And honestly, there's something genuinely moving buried in that conclusion if you sit with it for a moment. Long before any formal laws about guardianship, long before any written word, long before anyone had ever conceived of an orphanage or a foster care system with paperwork and case files, ancient humans had already figured out through nothing more than instinct, empathy, and hard-won practical necessity that no child should simply be left alone in the world if there was any way at all to prevent it. That impulse wasn't a modern invention layered on top of some imagined cold, ruthless ancient past. It was there from the very beginning, woven directly into the social architecture that allowed our species to survive at all.